Hi, this is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we are going to use Docker to create our PHP development environment for our class. We will be using this in conjunction with the Murach PHP and MySQL textbook, the 4th edition. If you decide that you do not want to use Docker, you can look at the appendix and follow the instructions to either install it locally on your Mac computer or on your Windows computer. With that, let's go ahead and let's get started. At this point, after installing Docker Desktop, we have nothing as far as containers, nothing as far as images, and nothing as far as volumes, but we're going to take care of that shortly. We should have seen in the assignment that there was a zip file that we can download, and it's going to contain these folders, one for the configuration file for Windows. We'll talk when we get into debugging and showing how that works. We'll have to change our slashes when we are trying to do this for Mac OS, but we'll look at that. This is the Windows configuration for doing that. We can go ahead and see that we have a Docker folder. This has got all of the brains for creating all of our containers that we'll be using for our PHP environment. And then we also have the htdocs, which is going to be our web root when we are dealing with any of our files. And I've gone ahead and added a configuration file. If you're following this and you're not in my class, that's perfectly acceptable. I have a GitHub repository that just has the config.php. It doesn't have the Murach or the class setup for folders that we'll be using. But you can grab that and use that to follow along with us as far as getting the environment up. With our Docker Compose, this is our main file that we'll be using to generate our environment. We have several things. We have our PHP environment. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. We'll take a look first at our MySQL. This is going to pull the image for the MySQL database. It's going to grab the latest version that's out on Docker Hub. We are going to specify that we want to create a volume and that it is going to map into the Linux container at the var lib MySQL directory. We are going to use port 3306 inside the container. So the right hand is on the inside, the left hand is on the outside. MySQL runs on 3306, so in the inside container, we must have 3306 specified. On the outside, we could specify anything we really want, but in our case, we're just going to leave it as is. We have the restart. Unless it's stopped, we're going to restart it. We have environment variables that we're using here. We're going to set the MySQL root password, the MySQL database, the user, and the password. And you'll notice that we have variables that are defined. We have the information stored in our .env file. Typically, the .env file, that's a special file that's for environment. And we typically lock it down from a security perspective and not let everybody see the contents of this if we were working in a real environment because it has passwords inside. Now, if we go back to our Docker Compose, we have the root password, so we can see that the root password variable is here and the value associated is there. And when we come back into our Docker Compose, we basically put our variables that we defined in the env contained within curly braces with a $ preceding. So that's going to be a variable that gets replaced when the Docker Compose file is actually run. We are pretty much constraining our resources down to limits of 0.5 for the CPU and 400 for our memory. If we do not try to constrain our containers to certain limits, if Docker thinks that it needs more resources, it's just going to go get them. In some cases, if we're talking about the MySQL, it's going to use as much as we give it. So it's always going to be topped out pretty high at like 95 to 97%. So we might as well constrain it so it's not trying to take all the memory on our computer. We also have our PHP MyAdmin. This is what we use to administer our database. We can use an external IDE like MySQL Workbench or something like that, we would just need to know the exposed port on the outside if we were going to connect to the MySQL database with the MySQL Workbench. That would be something that we would need from a configuration standpoint, but in our case, we're going to use the PHP MyAdmin tool to try to follow along with what the book's doing. And for that, we are pulling the latest image. Notice that this is going to be a web application. It's going to be running on port 80 inside the container. We are going to expose and utilize port 9001, connect to that container to run the application. We'll be using 9001 as the port. We have a couple of environment variables that we're specifying that our PMA host is essentially going to be the service that we define for our MySQL database. And then we have our root password. Again, that's defined within our env file. And we have resource constraints that we've put on this. And notice here that we have this container depending on our MySQL database. It utilizes the MySQL database, therefore there is a dependency, and that's going to ensure that when the containers are created, that they will be running on the same network. It's going to generate a default network, and both of those will be running together so they can talk to each other. We can also see that on our PHP container, or essentially our Apache container, we also have a dependency on our MySQL database as well. If we look at our build here, so we will be doing a build and creating an image from within our Docker Compose file, and it's going to be using our Docker file, and it's got the path location of the Docker file. And if we look in our PHP folder, we have our Docker file, and what this is essentially going to be doing, and I'm just going to get rid of this suggestion from Visual Studio Code, we will be using the PHP 8.2 Apache image, pulling that down. We're setting our work directory to the var www.html directory. We're doing a bit of configuration and updates from within our container. This is all in Linux mode. We're including our curl and wget and XDebug and adding our ini file into the user local etc php directory. And if we look at it, we have our ini file specified here that has a few configuration settings there. We go back. We are also doing an install of PDO. That's a way that we can use to do a connection to the MySQL database. And we are also going to add our XDebug, and we're exposing everything on port 80 on this image that we're building here. If we go back to our Docker Compose file, we have some volumes that we're setting up here. So essentially everything is mapped from our file structure into locations within our Linux container. And we have our htdocs. So this folder here is going to be mapped to the var www.html directory. So essentially that var www.html directory is the root for our web instance, and we want to map this directory to that directory so that if we make changes from within this file structure, those changes will be reflected in our Linux container for the Apache that we'll be using for PHP development. We also are going to then map in a couple of our config files for essentially the purposes of doing our XDebug, for instance, and then an error reporting. And those are over here, and you can look at them if you want to see what's in them. We have some configuration here for our XDebug for the debug option. We don't have anything else for the trace or anything else that we're configuring there, but it'll allow us to debug against our container from within Visual Studio Code. If we go back to our Docker Compose file, then we have our environment variables that we set up. Again, we are specifying some of those values that we set up for MySQL in our container as well. We are going to set our host.docker internal, make sure that that is configured correctly. We have our port 80 inside that's going to be exposed as port 9000 outside. Again, we are constraining our resources to ensure that they're just not going to take whatever it is that they need. We can always add additional resources if we need to, but we want to control that, not have Docker control that. At this point, let's go ahead and open a terminal window, or if you want to open up a PowerShell window, as long as you're in the directory. So you need to change into the directory, or if you're in a terminal on macOS, you need to be in the directory. If you don't happen to be within the Docker directory, when you execute the docker compose command, it's going to fail. So we need to do a change directory into our Docker directory. Once we are in our Docker directory, we can go ahead and enter our docker compose up --build -d. And we can see that it's starting to pull some of those images from Docker Hub. We're building our new image, and we have created our containers, and we're done now. If I go over to Docker Desktop, I can see that I have a volume. We named our volume, if I kind of scroll over here just a little bit on our database, to be MySQL data. It's using the directory, so the Docker directory _ MySQL data for that naming convention. We have our two images that we pulled from Docker Hub, the PHP MyAdmin and the MySQL. And then this is the service name, essentially, with the directory name that we built our image. So this is our Apache image that we built. If we look at our containers, we have underneath Docker, the MySQL _DB, the PHP-env, and then the PHP MyAdmin. So this is the Apache server. If I would happen to click on the little arrows, I can view details of my container. It's going to show me the log files. It's also going to allow me to look at any stats on that container, so I can take a look at how things are actually running. I can do an inspect in case sometimes we have to have like networks and IP addresses within our container. We can get that information from inspecting our container. I'm going to go back. And if I drill into the terminal this time, if I do an ls-l, it's going to give me a listing, and essentially it's going to show me the root directory here. I have my apps, my book apps, my final project, lab apps, and my config.php. So I'm sitting at my web root at this point. I can actually do a cat or something of the config.php and see the information there. So I have all of that mapped inside of that container. I can do the same with some of the other images as well, but in this case, we are going to go to a browser. We want to run that config file. So let's go ahead and bring it up. I need to move my Docker Desktop over here a bit. I want to look at my settings here. We see that we have port 9000. So when we execute against this, this is going to be on localhost 9000. And I'm just going to do config.php. This should be sitting at the web root. And I'm going to expand this just a little bit so that we can look at it. If we scroll through here pretty fast, we can see that we have the Apache environment. It's giving us a bit of information. We have some of our utilities that we loaded in that were added. If we keep continuing on, we can see the do for our MySQL instance. And if we continue on, we should see that we have the XDebug. You should see the step debugger is enabled on that XDebug. If we would go ahead now and instead bring up 9001, so localhost :9001, we should be in our PHP admin, I can put in root as my username. And then if we go back to our env file, we can get our password. I can copy that, go back here and paste it in, and log into my PHP MyAdmin. We have our My Guitar Shop 1 database that we indicated as our default database. So that's kind of how we can get our environment set up. Now I just kind of want to quickly talk through about the container management when we are done working on our PHP. If I go ahead and bring Docker Desktop back over, one of the things that I can do is when I'm done working in my PHP environment, I can just shut down the containers and I can exit out of them by stopping them. Once they are stopped, I can then exit out of my interface for Docker Desktop. I'm not going to do that, but realize that you also need to come down into the taskbar and stop the Docker Desktop option because Moby's still running in your taskbar in order to totally shut down Docker. I want to leave it up because I want to restart my container. I would just come in and start it. So that's the first way that you can work with your containers. The next way is if I just want to remove my containers, as long as I keep my volume and I keep those images, especially the one that we built, I can just come in here and at the command line again, I can do a docker compose down, and that's going to remove my containers. If I go back to my Docker Desktop environment, my containers are gone, but I still have my images, including the one that we built, and I still have my volume, so anything that I've done inside my database, I've retained that. I can come back the next day or in 5 hours or whatever it is that I want to start working on it again. I can do a docker compose up-d. I don't need the build this time because I've already got that image already built. I can just go ahead and create the containers, and I should be back in business. We have our containers now, and we can see that they're populated. So that's how I can work with my containers after I've gone through the creation process. If you have any questions, please let me know.